This is the Team Performance Podcast, where we explore issues at the heart of leadership, team development, and organisational culture. I'm your host, Mark Gilroy, and in this episode, we're joined by consultant and coach David Chamberlain from Tribus People. Together, we talk about David's approach to equipping leaders with a toolkit and roadmap for their leadership journey, helping them find their identity using accountability, curiosity, and connection. Welcome to the latest in our series of interviews. I'm very happy to be joined by David Chamberlain today from Tribus People. David is an executive leadership, development and talent specialist with over 20 years experience across all markets in the UK, Asia, India and the US and Australia. That's pretty much all the continents covered, isn't it? I think between them.
Most of them.
Thank you for joining us, David.
Yeah, great to be here, Mark. Great to see you.
Maybe before we get started, it's probably worth saying that we do have quite a big connection in common, and that is the company and the product Performance Climate Systems or PCS. So David used to be part of the PCS team as a director, and although we never got to work together, I know that the practitioners that you help support during your time at PCS all speak really, really highly of you indeed. So I do feel kind of like I do know you
yeah,
by association.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a great little community as well. Really good group of people out there.
Should we start by just talking about leadership and maybe your first experiences of leadership, positive or negative? Are you happy to share what that looked like for you?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and I think a lot of it comes down to how we define leadership and what it is. And I think when you get asked that question, the first thing that comes to mind is, where have I been a leader of teams, or where have I been led by other people? And there's all sorts of sporting contexts and work contexts that I've had from relatively early stage in my life and then in my career. But I think it's important to acknowledge as well that probably the most difficult component of leadership and the most important part of leadership is actually leading ourselves. And how we do that, what that relationship is. And as I say, I think that is probably the most complex journey of leadership that anybody goes on. But it also informs a huge amount about how we lead other people. And I think that individual leadership journey is really important, is really crucial, but is also never done. My experience of being a leader is I'm constantly being presented with people challenges, with strategic challenges, the list goes on and on and on, and it's a continual process of evolution and a continual process of learning. So I don't know if that answered your question directly enough, but I think it's a good sort of way to challenge ourselves around how we actually think about leadership and what it actually is. And yes, it's the stereotypical things that come to mind, but fundamentally, a huge core component of it comes back to ourselves and our kind of leadership of ourselves and our understanding of ourselves, and therefore how we show up as leaders with other people.
I love that. I love that reframe. And it got me wondering about, to what extent the idea of self-leadership and leading others, what the Venn diagram looks like. What's the stuff that happens in the middle there's for you anyway, where you found that the lessons that you've, been able to bestow upon other people and the practices and the models and the tools, what sort of things have you ended up kind of taking into your own toolkit for self-leadership that have really helped you?
Yeah, there are a number of things that we talk about quite a lot from a business perspective, which I think really kind of resonate with the clients we work with, but also resonate with me on a personal level as well. I think one of them is this notion of curiosity, and how being curious about ourselves and curious about other people and curious about the world around us. And there's some really good research on curiosity. There's a guy called Todd Kashdan, if anybody's interested in looking it up, who talks about curiosity and different types of curiosity. So I think being curious is essential for leadership and for being an effective leader. I think accountability and ownership of what we're here to do, but also how we show up and the ways in which we behave and the ways in which we interact with ourselves and also interact with others is really, really important. And I agree. I think it is a Venn, but equally, I think at the center of it, at the center of that diagram, if you like, sits this notion of leadership identity, which is leading yourself effectively and understanding, what do I value? What's my purpose? Where am I trying to get to? How do I want to be? Where are my blind spots? And how do I develop myself through that lens of curiosity in many respects? to improve my leadership capability.
Yeah. I remember somebody once asked me many years ago, what if there was one quality that you could put in a bottle that you could maybe test for, or ask questions about, maybe at interview level. For me, it's curiosity. It's probably one of the most underrated qualities in an individual, because it counts for so much more than just asking great questions or just maybe pointing and poking here. But it's this really all-encompassing area of psychology that is actually quite a difficult thing to teach, I think. And develop. It can, I believe it can be developed, but when you meet someone who's deeply, deeply curious, you realize that actually that curiosity can then mean that they can turn their hand to lots and lots of different things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, I read a great quote. I can't remember who to attribute it to, but I read a great quote about curiosity, which is saying it's impossible to be angry and curious at the same time.
That's good. Yeah,
you can't do the two things together. But I think it's also important to know, particularly in a leadership context. I mean, one of our kind of strap line, if you like, as a business, as Tribus, is leadership at every level. And I think when you look at a number of what we would define as leadership competencies, so you could argue curiosity being one of those, ownership, accountability, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, all these things we associate with leaders, and we sort of go, we have to wait to be a leader till we can do those things. I don't think that's the case at all. I think there's probably 60-70% of the things that we define as leadership capabilities, which if everybody within an organization is doing them, will make the organization far more effective, but it will also make the leader's job a lot easier.
Yeah, it applies at all levels. A friend of mine is a kind of renowned child psychologist, and it's another big thing that she talks about rather than as a parenting style, curiosity actually, it counts for a lot. Getting really curious about why something's happened, or asking for more information, or looking for an emotion, and really trying to get under the skin of that rather than having a reaction, whether that's anger or any other classic parenting emotion that can come up, especially with little ones. I think there's a tremendous power in curiosity. I think we should encourage so much more of it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of organizations tend to keep curiosity in a bit of a box. I don't know if you found this. I think, I'm thinking about R&D teams and the kind of teams that would normally provide that kind of healthy irritation in an organization, pushing boundaries and pushing back at processes and structures and systems. Often they are sometimes kept physically very away from other groups and other teams, or they're kind of psychologically distanced and not invited to meetings, or only included later in the journey. And I sometimes wonder why that is, and what would happen if that could change.
Yeah, I think it can be quite confronting for an organisation to promote that as a trait, if you like, because it quite often challenges the status quo, and it challenges someone's status as a leader. You might be asked some difficult questions that maybe you're not comfortable answering, or you're not kind of prepared to engage in that kind of conversation. So, but I think if it's done, it has to be done. I mean, to your reference about sometimes that department that looks at those things and challenges is maybe seen as slightly separate and not inclusive as part of the business. You're almost better off not doing it. It's either you do it and you do it well and it forms a part of your culture. Otherwise, it's just a sort of tokenistic department or tokenistic feature of an organization. If you're going to do it, you need to do it. You need to do it properly.
I am quite curious, I should say, to find out more about what you were talking about earlier around leadership identity and that idea of leadership at every level. How do you tend to help people bridge that gap of, I've not got leadership in my job description, therefore I'm not a leader? How do you help people find things like an identity around leadership?
Yeah, I think there are probably levels to it. I think one is quite a sort of deep personal journey, which is maybe not the sphere of the work that we do in development and coaching, which may be a sort of slightly different focus. And it can be quite confronting sometimes. And I think it's really important to acknowledge as people that do what we do, there is a line between where we start and where we stop, and then where another professional starts and where that other professional stops. So I think it's really important to frame it like that. But I think if you can start to go back to curiosity, if you can start from that place of curiosity about wanting to learn more about yourself, how you show up, what you do, and then if you think about this idea of leadership at every level, I mean, it can be as simple as listing out, well, these are the things that you as an organization have as your leadership competencies. Which ones of these do you think that apply purely to a leader, and which ones of these do you think that could be useful for anybody within the organization? And make it quite simple and make it quite binary, really. But a lot of it does sort of feedback, and I mentioned ownership as well, to this idea of creating a state of ownership within individuals, that you have ownership for the organization, the culture, yourself, the way in which you show up. Ownership is quite different to accountability and responsibility, because it is a state from which people operate. So I think if you can sort of start, if you went with, if there are two pillars that I can integrate, first of all, what would they be? Curiosity would be one, ownership would be the other. If you can get those two, you can build everything else around that.
Yeah, and I can see what you meant there about sort of that can be quite confronting for a lot of organisations, particularly some older school leaders, because the thread that runs through both of those is letting go of a lot of stuff, ego, of control. So it requires an awful lot for an organisation that has been built on different kinds of pillars to then think about those as those different foundations. I'm with you there. I think you can see huge transformations in teams when they've got that type of thread running through them.
Yeah, and it also links, I mean, something I sort of looked at, we went to a conference actually in the States with David Marquet, who a lot of the listeners of this will be familiar with, who wrote a great book called Turn the Ship Around, and this notion of intent-based leadership, which actually speaks quite a lot to these two pieces of curiosity and ownership about getting people to think in a different way around structures, around hierarchies, and giving people, putting the control to where the information is, shifting control to where the knowledge is within teams and within organizations. And I think the way in which the world is shifting in terms of overall work culture, but also post-COVID, remote, the advent of AI and so on and so forth, and much more distributed, less hierarchical organizational structures, then I think these concepts are becoming much more relevant.
Yeah. And thinking about that, and thinking about some of your experience working across all the different markets that we talked about earlier in the podcast, what have been some of your observations about how teams' needs have shifted post-pandemic around things like development and leadership and culture? What have you noticed? Yeah.
I'm hesitating because I think there's two bits to the answer. I think one is you sort of framed it in an international context. So I think one thing that's really important to acknowledge is that not every international culture responds and works in the same way as the British culture or the American culture, or a kind of westernized view of doing leadership and doing self-development and so on and so forth. And I think when you look at what's been popularized, it's quite American focused. So if you look at a lot of the research, you look at the likes of Love Him or Hate Him, Simon Sinek, you look at Amy Cuddy, you look at Kim Scott, Radical Candor, all of this stuff that we hear about and we learn about, particularly around vulnerability, actually, is through a very Western, often US-centric lens. And when you're working with international teams, it can be very easy to have almost a sort of slight arrogance that everybody else should be at the same place and operating in the same way. Well, that's not actually always how it works. So I think you need to, when you're working with international groups, you need to think about that first and foremost.
Yeah, I remember. I remember that prior to joining PCS, I used to work with an international psychometrics firm, and one of the only areas of the world where some of the products weren't that successful was Japan, and we never really understood why until we actually went there and took a look at why was this so different. And fundamentally, one of the key things was how people view their jobs. It was so radically different in Japan to most other places in the world. And asking a simple question such as, what would you prefer to do? Or, if given a blank sheet of paper, what would your job look like? What we would now call job crafting. It's just absolutely, it was an arrogant and quite an offensive question to ask. in that part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not saying that we can't aspire to move people to greater vulnerability and self-awareness and so on and so forth. And it's not saying that every culture doesn't have that capability within it and individuals within those cultures. But I think there is a risk that it can be a bit arrogant to assume that everybody should want to operate the way in which we operate from a Western leadership philosophy perspective. But also, even if there is an appetite to change, you have to be very mindful about the speed of implementing that change. You can't go from 0 to 1,000,000 miles an hour in the space of 6 months. It might be a 3, 4, 5-year journey to take an organization or an individual within an organization to get them to that space. And I think we have to be a bit mindful. I mean, to your original question about what shifted, I think this notion of vulnerability, and I actually popped a post up on LinkedIn about this the other day, this sort of notion of vulnerability in and of itself, which everybody sort of espouses as something that we should all be striving for as leaders, and we should be vulnerable and open. And again, there's some quite Americanized literature around this. And whilst I'm not saying for a moment that it isn't a useful trait and set of behaviors, if you like, to have, setting the expectation for some people, particularly if they are new leaders, to be completely vulnerable, and the way in which they interpret and perceive that word can be really confusing. So vulnerability isn't necessarily going, this is me and this is everything about me and these are my struggles and so on and so forth. It can be something as simple as, if you're a new leader, admitting that you don't know all the answers, or asking for help from one of your team members on something that you're leading on. For example, on a project you're leading on, that is a demonstration of vulnerability. So I think there are these sort of cultural shifts that are happening. And I think the speed at which the media is produced and a lot of popular psychology is produced around all these ideas and concepts is much, much faster than people can actually consume and implement. So I think our roles as development professionals, coaches, whatever it may be, is to be really kind with people on how we take them on that journey. But I think also it's really important to acknowledge that it's their best interests that we should be serving, not our own best interests in terms of, oh, aren't I clever? I've read this new book and this is how you should all be doing it. And don't I sound intelligent when I facilitate this session, for example? It's not about you. It's about the people that you work for and you work with.
Yeah. As soon as you're in that place, things like curiosity and ownership have gone. If a facilitator or a leader's been positioned as an expert, it doesn't do well for encouraging curiosity. And that got me wondering about, when it comes to vulnerability and that idea of the nuances of vulnerability, that actually often we have this way of sort of looking at things like that and qualities like that in a really binary way, and saying you're either a vulnerable leader or you're not. Whereas actually there's a huge spectrum of vulnerability in there, and at one end of that scale there is the kind of bulletproof, old school kind of dinosaur leader, where they are the expert, no one challenges them, what they say goes, and there's usually like a picture of them in the door as you walk in of the office. It's that kind of place. And then on the opposite side of that scale, you've got almost kind of 100% vulnerability 100% of the time, which for some people, particularly the persons or people being led by that type of leader, it might be terrifying to have that level of vulnerability open all of the time. So I think, as with a lot of things, it's about finding balance, isn't it? About finding that place on the line to be what the team needs at that point in time.
Yeah, and I think that last phrase, to be what the team needs, is the critical component. Otherwise vulnerability can become this sort of self-indulgent exercise that doesn't actually serve the needs of the people that you're working. I'm not saying vulnerability isn't a good thing, like it absolutely is, don't get me wrong. But it needs to be done in a caring way, in a way that meets people where they are. If you are leading people to help them be more vulnerable, but also if you are role modeling vulnerability as a leader, you sort of need to be a little bit selective with it. Can't be all the time on everything, because then you're putting a lot on other people.
Yeah, I love that phrase of meeting people where they are as well. That's a really cool, and it makes me think about PCS. I think a lot of people look towards leadership development as a way of navigating that boundary of sort of figuring out what do my team need from me? What do I need to be in this situation, in this culture, in this context? What kind of chameleon shape do I need to take this week, month, year? And I think one of the great things about PCS is that it's a tool that takes the guesswork out of that, and it makes it actually quite transparent about what the team need and what their perceptions of you currently are at the moment. Are you able to share a bit more about kind of your PCS practitioner journey and maybe some of the reasons that you tend to use a tool like that with groups?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously I know it inside out and sort of help build it and design it and everything else, right? So something I'm very familiar with, all the different components and how it works and so on. I think we use it with pretty much every engagement that we do with clients and with groups. I think for us, and the reason I first sort of fell in love with it, if you like, pre-joining PCS actually a number of years ago, was when I reflected on my own, what at the time would have been a management journey, if you like. My first proper management job I had when I moved to Australia, I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to start, what order to do things in, what the different components of having a team and a high-performing team would necessarily be. And I think the beauty of PCS is it does give you this kind of roadmap. It's like a sort of step-by-step, start with vision, goal clarity, do your goals, roles, processes, get those transactional bits right. You're then into the transformational hemisphere, adaptability, connection, resilience. And it gives you this great benchmark of where are we right now? What do we need to focus on? In what order? And how do we get there? And I think what it does for us, like a lot of the work that we do, particularly with senior leadership teams, we do a lot of work around alignment. So aligning senior teams around the sort of shared vision for where we're trying to get to, and how do we do that? But really importantly, aligning the commercial ambition with the cultural and high-performing team ambition. And I think in a lot of one of the core challenges in team leadership development is it's quite often seen by organizations as this separate thing that sits outside. But I think if you can view it as an extension and an enabler of realizing a commercial objective or set of commercial objectives, then you pull in the data component that comes with PCS. It's a really nice little segue that links those two things together. And then people go, right, this is commercially where we're trying to get to. We've got the right conditions in order to do that. We're the team that's going to deliver it. What does it mean to be high performing? We've got this diagnostic, which has given us a really good indication of what we're doing well, what we're not, where there's difference between team and leader. We've got our roadmap. Off we go. Let's make it happen. Let's bring this thing to life.
So all about empowerment in this case.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not, I think the leadership stuff is not a dark art, right? I think, there's sort of, doesn't matter how many programs you go and design, and we design loads of them in loads of different ways, and we use all sorts of different methodologies and experiential stuff, and all sorts of really exciting, fun stuff. But fundamentally, it all comes back to these kind of core concepts. So it's then about, well, how do you present it? How do you deliver it? How do you engage people on that journey and through that process? And I think for us, having PCS as part of the toolkit is a really useful way to put some data, put some numbers, put some insights, have a nice visual representation, and give people that guidance and that handrail to help them deliver as a team, to help them deliver as an organization, but also to help them deliver as individuals within that.
And you mentioned the toolkit. I'm quite curious to know what sort of tools, without giving away too much of the secret sauce around kind of how your packages and services work. What things do you find that tend to complement PCS really well? What other tools do you tend to combo it with?
Yeah, so there's a culture diagnostic that we use, and obviously culture and climate are different things. So I think having the culture piece, having the climate piece, there are individual psychometrics we can use to sort of complement that, I guess, that leadership identity piece that we spoke about and leading self. There are some, and I won't mention specific ones, but there are some major caveats around that. I would encourage people to check the academic validity of any very popularized psychometric personality profiling tools that they use, just to make sure that they are based in pretty robust sound research, and they are delivering what you actually want them to deliver, and are more positive in terms of their outcomes than damaging, which can often be a risk. So
there's a lot of snake oil out there. In fact, I'm looking just over my shoulder. There is a book about a particular tool, and a bit of a vicious takedown of one of those. But yeah, it's a shame really, because for the few tools that aren't particularly evidentially robust, there's a whole slew of really, really powerful tools that are incredibly empirically valid that often get lumped within the same category.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are lots of individual psychometrics that are really useful. I think there is I haven't used it, but I know when I was at PCS, there is a really good alignment tool. Actually, there's a thing called Mirror. I can't remember the name of the lady who runs that business, but she's a PCS practitioner, so they have quite a good tool. I think they use, and there's some really good leadership 360s out there as well. Again, I think on 360s, I always caution people around the timing of doing them. And also the intention of doing them, because most people have heard of a 360, and quite often we'll get L&D professionals, sometimes MDs, CEOs will come and say, oh, look, we just want to do a 360 on the whole group, the whole senior leadership team. And then we sort of start digging into the weeds. Okay, well, how would you rate kind of psychological safety at the moment within your organization using, this framework, for example? Tim Clark's work's really good. I like his work around psychological safety in the 4 stages model. And they go, well, actually, yeah, it's not great. We've kind of got bullying, and we've got intimidation, and we've got problems with absenteeism through, mental health issues related to work problems and so on and so on. Well, do you think now is the best time to be doing a 360, or do we need to kind of go through a bit of an iterative process to get us there? So, and we part of our business, we're effectively a leadership business. We also do senior leadership recruitment and executive search as part of our offering. And there is a great platform that we use as part of that, which kind of utilizes 3 different areas. So one is around competencies, the other is around values, and then the third is sort of effectively personality linked, but it's utilizing the Big 5 model, which from an academic validity perspective is probably the most robust one out there. So, I mean, we're very open to new tools, to new ideas. And I think, there's some interesting things out there. Enneagram is quite interesting. Lumina is quite interesting. Again, there's a bit of a mixed bag. I think it's just about picking the right diagnostic for the program of work you're using and for the people you're working with. It's not going, well, I just use this tool, and therefore I'm only going to use this tool, even if it doesn't actually suit the needs of the client. Yeah,
that's right. There's that a classic one of if all you ever use is a hammer, everything starts to look like nails very quickly. So it is having the right tool for the job is and there are some good Swiss Army knife tools out there, but I think it is. I'm with you. I think it is helpful to have a good selection to choose from. Yeah. You just reminded me of a situation where thinking about timing of 360s. I did some work a few years back with an organisation where they had this. It was an international organisation. We're talking about five figures of employment, and they had this thing called Survey Week, where I think it was towards the end of September. They'd basically arranged for every single type of survey that would be happen over the course of a year to be pushed into that week. So 360s, engagement, culture, values work. It was all being pushed out, and every single person was doing every single survey under the sun inside of that week. It was a very tight deadline, but for them, they decided that was the way to work it. And I thought to myself, crikey, that even thinking about that kind of objectively, scientifically, it would have played a massive role in terms of the validity of the results, because if you were completing surveys all week and then you got to the kind of 4 p.m. on a Friday and you got a 360 through, that had to impact the results. It had to, but they were adamant that was the way to do it.
And I guess it's challenging that question of why are you doing it like that? Like, whose need does that meet? Is it does it smack of that's just a tokenistic thing that we're doing because we need to say that we're doing all these surveys? It's potentially a bit of a minefield.
It was a minefield. So thinking about all the tools that you mentioned there, so there's quite a good selection of tools that you would typically deploy in a kind of classic, typical in inverted commas intervention with a group or an organization. What sort of time would you then work with them over if you were using a good selection of tools like that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the project. I mean, most of our engagements are minimum 6 months. Right. There's a number of clients we've been working with for sort of 3+ years, where we sort of started with one division of the business, and then they've had a great experience with what we've done, both in the alignment work and also in the development work, and sort of those development of core skills around leading through change and communication and management, leadership, and so on. And then we've applied that into another division, and then another division, and then another division. And I think the timing on the tools. There are certain programs that we run. We work with quite a lot of private equity-backed businesses, particularly when they've just had investment, so they're going through a pretty rapid growth phase to the next event, the next exit. And there is a relatively sort of standardized process with a couple of tools that we use in the first phase of that. But then what that kicks out will then determine what the program looks like going forward, and the point at which you would use another diagnostic, another tool. I mean, I think there is a risk that you over-diagnose stuff.
Yeah.
And you need to be reliant on data and data points and so on and so forth. But equally, you need to be mindful not to overdo it. And to your example of getting people to do like 6 different surveys in the space of a single week or a day or whatever it might be, you kind of get survey fatigue. So I think you just need to be a bit mindful, a bit aware of that.
Yeah. I think with those, I personally tend to look at those types of things as a way to unlock the door to maybe the less curious in a team. Mm-hmm. I think there are some groups, I'm thinking about like academics, really highly technical audiences, where actually getting a great facilitator in front of them and just let's have a discussion about culture or climate or leadership. It's too much, it's too broad, and sometimes too confronting for them just to get really into that box without any kind of preamble or context. But actually having some data, almost like a kind of, it's a key that will unlock the conversational door into some of those areas that actually alleviates the load and the responsibility, I guess, of the facilitator there. Because there's, as you said, with that roadmap analogy, it actually allows you to give the team so much more of the ownership of where they take the discussion, where they take the actions, without having to necessarily kind of shape it and construct it with them on the day, and have those kind of cynical team members say, look, we've all worked with them, right? Where they're sort of sat in the room kind of with their arms crossed and the brows furrowed, going, yeah, you teach me something new here. This having data and reports, and whether it's psychometrics or surveys, diagnostics, it just tends to help unlock, particularly that kind of audience I've found.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's also important as part of that to acknowledge that and I always say this when we sort of go into engagements with clients and with groups, and particularly if you've got a single cohort, single group of people who are going through a journey together, be that 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever it might be. The learning is a core component of that, obviously. The diagnostics are a core component. The data that comes out of those, the frameworks and models and so on and so forth, and the exercises and activities that they do, the learning experience is absolutely critical. But alongside that, it's as much about them going through that experience and that journey as a group as it is about the content. And those connections, and it's sort of two sides of the same coin, if you like, because on one side you've got, well, here's all the diagnostics and the frameworks and the learning and everything else, but you guys are doing this together, you are experiencing it together, you are having conversations together, you are building awareness of each other, finding out interesting things about each other, and communicating with each other outside of the sessions that we facilitate for you. And that's the secret sauce, because that's kind of high performing teams, right? It's not a group of people in isolation with a whole load of knowledge. It's a group of people operating together using the relevant tools and frameworks and so on and so forth. But ultimately, it's about all of their individual interactions and their collective interactions. That's what creates a high performing team.
Yeah, I was catching up on some YouTube videos over the weekend, and I came across this artist called Jacob Collier. He's a musician. He's like a multi-instrumentalist musician. And his big thing is that at his concerts, the audience become a kind of instrument for him, where he has them kind of singing at different melodic pitches and creating these harmonies almost kind of intuitively. I read a piece afterwards. I was kind of really interested to know more about how that all worked, and they said that actually in choirs, in kind of choral groups, even if a choir hasn't sung with each other ever, when neuroscientists looked at what was happening when they sang together a single piece of music, they found two things were really interesting that happened. The first thing was that their heart rates synced up almost exactly, but also when they looked at brain imaging, they found that the brain waves were almost modulating at the same frequency. So this idea of kind of like almost like a shared consciousness was happening within rooms like this. And you see it in teams sometimes when teams are really kind of click. High performing teams, high energy teams, however it's framed, it is like that. It's like they are acting as one mind in the best possible way, away from kind of groupthink and bias and all of those types of things. But actually, it always calls to mind that idea of a kind of a choral group where they're producing the same note.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really interesting. And the other thing I sort of think about, and I play the piano, right? And some of the most sort of wonderful music you can play is not necessarily the standardized chords. It's where you sort of add a seven, or you add some kind of diminished note, or whatever it might be. And I think the beauty of people working together where there is that symbiosis, if you like, but also where there is a little bit of difference, is the difference that makes it really, really interesting as well. So don't get me wrong, it can't be a note that's completely in the wrong scale, in the wrong key, that doesn't go. But you do need that little bit of difference in order to make the sound as kind of rich and interesting as it can possibly be. But I think it's also important, and I mean, maybe now's not the call to get into the detail on this, but it does speak to some of the challenges around the current conversation on remote work and being in person. And if that creation of synchronicity is an objective for high performing teams, I guess it's a question: is it possible to recreate that when you are not physically in the same space ever? In a work context outside of socials. So I mean, it's maybe a much bigger topic than one we've got time to go into today, but
sounds like a LinkedIn discussion waiting to happen. That one it's a huge topic, but it's a really relevant one. I think a lot of organizations are still trying to figure that part out around, because I've noticed a bit of a swing, actually. We can touch on it for a little while. I think that seems to be a bit of a swing back. There was a CIPD report that was released last year that demonstrated that actually a lot of people who had never experienced kind of 9 to 5, 100% office time work would actually prefer to work more in the office if certain conditions were met. For example, I'm thinking back to the report. I want to say there was it was small things like the ability to have a coffee voucher so that when they did come in, they didn't have to pay for a nice coffee, like one coffee a week. That would have been the difference between them spending 4 days a week rather than 2, which seems like actually a pretty decent trade-off for a company. But it does seem like there's a bit of a swing back, and actually that organizations are starting to find that more and more people are looking for an in-person experience, whether that's in an office or some sort of remote working setup, rather than just constantly wanting to be at home all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's a long list of clients we work with where this is like one of their front and center biggest challenges at the moment. Like, we went fully remote during COVID. We now would like people to come back in the office for a sometimes defined number of days, which is more often than not 2, maybe 3 days a week. And we're getting enormous pushback around it. And I think one of the one of the interesting things I've noted is that a lot of the people who are having to make the decisions on this are of probably a similar generation to myself. I'm not quite sure how old you are, Mark, but where this wasn't the norm, and there is maybe a bit of a blind spot around what people actually want and what's going to motivate them and how they're going to operate in the most effective way. So I think it's important to sort of first be mindful, a little bit mindful of who you've got making the decisions on this stuff. But equally, I do think, and this is maybe a little bit controversial, but I think where you get people saying, I don't want to come in the office because it doesn't work for me. And for example, I am an introvert, and I would contend that no one is an introvert or an extrovert. We all operate on a scale, and it's context specific, and you can have the biggest introvert in the world and you take them out for a couple of beers and they're dancing on the table, right? So it doesn't always work like that. But I think that the point that's sometimes missed in that position is it's not about you. It's about the people you work with, and it's about imparting that knowledge and that information and those insights to the people in a physical space. And I'm not saying you can't do it if you're in a remote environment, but it's a lot more difficult. It's a lot more difficult. And by default, it tends to be much more prescribed, as in we have this block of time where we are all online together and all working together. But I do still think you miss those things. And don't get me wrong, there are some organizations who are fully remote. They've always been set up that way. It works brilliantly. The people who work for them want to operate in that environment, and they've got really effective organizations. So you absolutely can do it. But I think there is risk, as I say, in this focus on ourselves as individuals and what works for us, which is often to the detriment of actually, I'm part of a community, I'm part of a choir. How do I make that choir sing in the most effective way? And maybe that means that a day a week, or possibly 2 days a week, it would be great for me to come in because I've got all this knowledge, I've got this energy, I've got this information I can share. Even if I'm very introverted as a personality type, there's still a huge amount I can bring to other people. It may just be in more of a one-on-one context, not in a huge group context.
Yeah, it is. And this, well, if we're sharing controversial thoughts, here's mine for the pot. I think a lot of that does lie at the feet of HR teams whose job it is to build policies that apply to everyone. And the challenge with that is that as a lot of organizations have found with hybrid approaches, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. When you give people a choice, actually their choice is going to be dependent on lots of different personal things, whether it's about being able to take the kids to school, or whether it's about being able to be home at a certain time for a kind of social club or any other engagement. Everyone's got different needs, and I think once you open that door to saying we'll cater for that, it's quite difficult to then put that into a box, a very neatly defined boundaries box that's part of a contract that says, yeah, actually, we're going to mandate that you come in 2 or 3 days a week, and this is the kind of work that we do on those days. It becomes really difficult to wind that back. So I think there's something around the kind of the culture of policy making, and it's back to goals, roles, and processes. Are they all aligned? I think in a lot of cases they aren't. That people are just, again, they stumble by over the course of the pandemic and the lockdowns, and that's actually become policy over time, rather than going, stop, okay, let's take a moment and reflect. What's worked, what hasn't, what still needs a question mark putting next to it that we can evolve. And it might be all of it. But unfortunately, that doesn't align with a lot of company cultures, particularly HR culture.
Yeah, no, it's hard. And it also sort of speaks to this question of, well, what is work there to actually do?
Yes.
What is work there to be? And there's a great thing called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is something that comes out every year, which basically looks at different levels of trust within different spheres of society. So NGOs, governments, companies, and so on and so forth. And what they found when they did it this year, it's only just come out. If anybody wants to jump on, I just whack it in a Google search. What they found this year is that trust in government and every other sphere is pretty much its lowest level that it's ever been. So we've got a society where people aren't feeling like they are being looked after by the stereotypical structures and processes that should exist within societies. So therefore, they are looking more to the workplace to fill that gap. And then the problem that then occurs is work ends up being everything to everybody, which is kind of an impossible task.
Yeah.
And, you know, interesting in sort of bringing it back to PCS. I mean, I ran a workshop quite recently, which was talking about a study that came out of the University of Oxford a few months ago, which basically was this massive analysis of the effectiveness of wellbeing initiatives. So billions are spent on wellbeing initiatives. So they looked at 4 years worth of data, 46,000, I think, participants. So massive data set. And they found that when they looked at all these individual wellbeing initiatives, what effect did they have? None of them made any difference. There was one small exception where there's a slight positive impact from volunteering, but outside of that, none of it worked. So we're spending all this time, this money, and if you think of it in a PCS context, it's that transformational hemisphere.
Yeah.
And very often, and I was working with a client at the moment, the head of HR is part of the head of people and culture is part of the senior leadership team. And she said, actually, we were literally just about to press the button on a huge spend on wellbeing initiatives, but we've just run PCS. It was part of the PCS workshop. And actually what this has highlighted is there are quite a few things in that transactional space around roles and responsibilities, around team balance, around resources and structure, around communication that we don't have right. So if we haven't got those transactional bits right, if we haven't got the boring basics in place, those foundations in place, like no wonder people are feeling like they've got no life balance, they don't feel supported, because
it's not going to stick.
We haven't created the conditions for that to actually happen. So it's so important that you get that foundational stuff right to then work out, well, and I'm not saying don't do wellbeing initiatives for a moment. Like, absolutely, they can be brilliant if they are targeted in the right way and they are done for the right reasons. But if you view them in isolation as the solution, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. The data tells us it doesn't work. So why are we doing it? Why are we not making sure that in combination we get the basics right, we get the foundations in place first?
Here. Right, we've put the world to rights now, David. I think that's we've covered all bases. We've done politics, work culture, leadership.
Yeah.
I think we've covered it off. That's a really good place for us to start to wrap up. Thank you so much for everything you've shared on the podcast today. It's been wonderful having you. If people wanted to find out any more about what you do, who you are, how they can work with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, so obviously on LinkedIn, so David Chamberlain, and our website is Tribus People, TRIBUS people.co.uk, and feel free to reach out.
Super. And I'll make sure that I link all of the different authors' articles and that vulnerability piece that you put together in the show notes, so they should be in the description for the podcast if you want to check that out too. Thanks for joining us, David. See you next time.
Thanks, Mark. Cheers.
If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by subscribing and leaving a review on your favourite podcast app. Meanwhile, if you're interested to learn more about how the PCS approach can help you explore leadership, performance and culture within your business, get in touch with our team at performanceclimatesystem.com and we'll be happy to help. See you next time with another great guest.